The ocean is very good at keeping secrets. Somewhere beneath the waves, there are coins from a Spanish galleon, a half-rotted bottle of rum, and perhaps the bones of a man who once called himself a captain. He might have sailed with Blackbeard, or under Charles Vane, or beside Bonny when she refused to hang her head for any man. They were all chasing the same mirage, freedom. Not the kind written in laws or printed on flags, but the kind that smells like salt and danger and never having to say "I" to anyone again. For a few wild years, they almost found it. The ocean became their kingdom, the wind their ally, and every ship on the horizon their chance to start over or burn trying. But the tide always turns. It always has. And when it did, the world remembered their names, even as it forgot their faces. So tonight, as you settle into the quiet, we'll drift back to that forgotten age, to the ships and the storms, the stolen gold and the strange democracy that arose and fell with the waves. A world where men like Blackbeard terrified empires and women like Bonny defied them. And maybe, if we listen closely, we'll hear what the sea still remembers. But before you settle in, make sure you're comfortable. Turn on the fan if you need to. Pull the blankets close. Let your mind loosen like a rope in the tide. And if you'd like to keep traveling with me through history, do well to like this video and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing our little community scattered across the globe. Now, with the world growing still, let's begin our journey. Every great lie begins with a little truth, and the lie that drew thousands of men to sea in the 17th century was a simple one: the promise of freedom. For most of Europe's poor, freedom was a dream you only dared to whisper. On land, you were bound by lords, debt, or hunger. The sea seemed to offer an escape. Sailors heard rumors in the ports, stories of men who'd thrown off their masters, stolen a ship, and now lived like kings on the open waves. No rules, no taxes, no sermons, just the horizon. But what those stories didn't mention was that the horizon was not freedom, it was emptiness. Endless miles of blue that could turn gray and lethal by afternoon. Still, for a desperate man with nothing to lose, even emptiness looked better than another year of laboring for someone else's supper. So they came. They came from London's alleys, from the prisons of Bristol, from broken merchant crews that hadn't been paid in months. They came from every edge of a world where men were told to kneel. And for a brief moment, on the deck of a stolen ship, they stood upright. The pirate codes made it sound democratic. Crews could vote to elect their captains. Loot was divided according to agreed shares. Even punishments were decided collectively. Compared to the naval system, where captains ruled by lash and chain, it felt like paradise, a strange, drunken form of equality. But equality on a pirate ship was a thin plank to stand on. The moment someone questioned authority too loudly, they were accused of mutiny and tossed into the sea. Democracy worked fine as long as everyone agreed with the captain. And when they didn't, well, there were plenty of sharks happy to mediate. Still, the myth held power. A man could join a crew and for the first time in his life have a voice. He could curse the king without losing his tongue. He could call his captain by name, not title. He could own a pistol, not polish one for someone richer. To men used to bowing, even that taste of freedom was intoxicating. But the cost of that taste was high. Pirate life didn't pay in gold. It paid in risk. One ship might take weeks to find a target worth boarding. When they did, the battle could last minutes, brutal, smoky minutes, where you couldn't tell if the red on your sleeve was wine, blood, or rust. And once the fight was over, you might find your prize wasn't treasure at all, but barrels of salted herring and a cargo of damp wool. That was the first lesson of freedom at sea. It rarely came with profit. The second lesson was that liberty didn't mean safety. The sea was lawless, yes, but nature didn't care about your rebellion. Waves didn't bow to your new constitution. One storm could tear apart every illusion you'd built. Men who shouted about independence while drunk on rum would spend the next morning clinging to broken wood, praying for land like frightened children. And yet they stayed. They stayed because the alternative was worse. On land, they were servants. On sea, they were partners in crime. There's a strange pride in that, a twisted dignity. When a pirate looked around the deck and saw 50 men who'd chosen this life, he saw brothers, not soldiers following orders, but volunteers in a shared madness. That feeling mattered more than comfort. Most pirates had known nothing but command, bosses, wardens, priests, officers. On a pirate ship, no one wore a crown. That illusion of equality, even fragile, gave them a sense of self that the empire had denied. They weren't subjects anymore. They were something else entirely, free agents of chaos.
Of course, chaos doesn't feed you. And it doesn't fix the sails when they rip or the hull when it leaks. Freedom sounds poetic in a tavern, but out there, it's just work. Endless work. Hauling ropes until your palms blister. Climbing rigging slick with salt. Sleeping in a space so small you can't stretch your legs. There were no weekends, no holidays, no clock to punch. Just the rhythm of wind and orders shouted through the dark. So what kept them from leaving? Why didn't they swim for shore the first chance they got? Because, for many, the ship wasn't a prison. It was a mirror. It reflected who they'd become, men outside every law, every expectation. Men who had already been condemned by the world they left behind. A runaway apprentice couldn't just walk back into town. A deserter from the Navy would hang. A thief couldn't apply for a pardon. The pirate ship was their last refuge, and like all refuges, it was both sanctuary and trap. Those who romanticize pirates forget that almost none of them retired rich. A handful, Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Bonny, made names that history still whispers. But for every famous captain, there were hundreds of nameless sailors who drowned before 40, their bodies never found.
Still, people kept joining. Perhaps it was the stories. Every port had a version. The ship that vanished with gold. The captain who escaped justice. The lover waiting on a far shore. Hope has a way of surviving logic. And when you've been told all your life that you'll die poor, even a 1 in 1,000 chance at glory feels worth the gamble. Freedom, in the pirate sense, was never about doing whatever you wanted. It was about being beyond reach.
Beyond kings, beyond taxes, beyond the endless sermons telling you how to live. Out there on the open water, no one cared where you were born or how clean your hands were. You were defined only by your usefulness and your nerve. There was a kind of brutal fairness in that. The ship didn't care about your class. The wind didn't favor nobles. If you could fight, patch a sail, or steer through fog, you had value. If not, you learned fast, or you starved. It was democracy by survival. And so the myth endured, not because it was true, but because it offered dignity to the undignified. Even as they slept beside rats, ate moldy biscuits, and waited for the next naval ship to appear on the horizon, they told themselves they were free men. That illusion, however thin, was worth more than comfort. They had traded obedience for uncertainty, and uncertainty to them was liberty. But freedom always carries a shadow, the question of what to do with it. Some captains used it to build strange floating societies, ships where rules were made by vote and treasure shared by share. Others turned tyrant, drunk on power, cruel as any monarch. Most simply drifted between ports, too superstitious to plan, too hungry to stop.
In the end, the myth of freedom was what kept them sailing and what destroyed them. It told them they were different from the world they'd fled, when in truth they were its reflection, just stripped bare. Greed, fear, loyalty, betrayal, the same old tides, only louder out there. When they raised their black flags, they weren't announcing liberation. They were declaring exile. But here's the strange thing about exile. Once you accept it, it begins to feel like home. To outsiders, piracy was rebellion. To the men themselves, it was routine. The days blended together: rope, salt, hunger, smoke. Freedom became just another chore. Still, at night, when the sea was calm and the stars scattered across the sky like cold lanterns, some of them must have looked up and thought, for all the misery, at least no one owns me here. That thought alone could keep a man alive for another voyage. Freedom in the pirate world was never comfortable, never noble, and never safe. But for men who'd spent their lives bent beneath someone else's boot, even that raw, perilous version was enough. So they clung to it, their tattered flag of defiance, against the wind, against the world, and against the truth that freedom without peace is just another kind of storm. And that, more than any treasure, was what it meant to live and die as a pirate.
Blackbeard, or Edward Teach, if you prefer his less dramatic name,
might be the best proof that freedom at sea came with a terrible smell.
He cultivated his image carefully. 6 feet tall, dark beard tied with ribbons, slow-burning fuses tucked beneath his hat so he looked like a man risen straight from hell. Sailors swore smoke followed him even when he wasn't fighting, as if the devil had taken up residence behind his eyes. But beneath the costume, he was still a sailor. And sailors, no matter how terrifying, still had to eat weevilled biscuits, swat flies, and try to sleep beside snoring men in a ship that reeked of rum and unwashed bodies. For all his fame, Blackbeard lived the same miserable routine as every other pirate. Endless labor, bad food, worse company, and a constant suspicion that someone was planning to stab him for his share of the loot. The man who terrified the Caribbean still itched from fleas. He still argued over who stole his portion of salted beef. Even legends, it turns out, get seasick. And that's the truth of pirate life. It wasn't adventure, it was maintenance. Every day was a chore. The sea was not a stage for heroism. It was a workplace, and a filthy one. From dawn until sunset, the crew's hands were never clean. They hauled ropes stiff with salt and tar, scraped barnacles from the hull, and mended sails that flapped like exhausted flags. The sun bleached their skin, cracked their lips, and turned the deck into a frying pan. A man could sweat through his shirt before breakfast. Below deck, the air barely moved. The ceiling was so low you had to crouch, and the floor was always wet, part seawater, part whatever spilled during last night's drinking. Hammocks swayed inches from each other, rank with the sour smell of damp linen and men who hadn't bathed since last port. You didn't just smell your crewmates, you lived inside their breath.
Privacy didn't exist. Modesty was forgotten. When nature called, you leaned over the rail and hoped the ship didn't lurch. Most learned to balance out of necessity. A few didn't, and their names became brief cautionary tales. Meals were no comfort. Pirates ate the same fare as any poor sailor, hard-tacked biscuits that had to be hammered apart, salted pork tough as leather, and beer so sour it counted as punishment. When the beer ran out, they mixed rum with stagnant water and called it grog. It didn't make the water clean, just easier to forget it wasn't. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they'd capture a ship carrying sugar, fruit, or coffee. Those were the good days. Brief festivals of eating until their stomachs rebelled. Then it was back to biscuits, salt, and the occasional rat roasted on a shovel. And yet, somehow, they found ways to laugh. The laughter was rarely pure. It was more of a survival reflex. Men told jokes about losing limbs, about hangings, about the captain's temper. They mocked their own hunger. A good story or a crude song could hold the crew together longer than any code of conduct. Discipline varied from ship to ship. Some captains ruled through fear, others through a strange sort of brotherhood. The pirate code might say every man had an equal vote, but that equality ended the moment rum and weapons entered the conversation. Arguments were settled with fists, knives, or in some cases, silence, the kind where one man simply went missing by morning. The sea was honest that way. It didn't need witnesses.
Blackbeard understood this better than most. His crew both feared and adored him. He played the role of the demon so convincingly that no one dared challenge him. But when he wasn't performing, he was strangely quiet. He'd sit on deck at night, staring at the horizon, running tar through his beard to keep it black. He'd tell the younger men to drink, to fight, to seize the moment, as if he already knew the moment couldn't last. He died at roughly 40, shot 5 times, cut 20 more, and still fighting when they took his head. His body was thrown into the sea, and sailors claimed it swam 3 laps around the ship before sinking. It's a fine story, though one suspects it improved with rum. Either way, the man who'd styled himself as the freest creature alive ended as fish food. That's freedom, pirate style. Brief, bloody, and over before you can enjoy it. Back on deck, the rest of the world carried on. For the living, there were ropes to haul and decks to scrub. The wind didn't care who'd just died. Someone had to swab the blood. Someone had to steer. Life on a pirate ship was the purest form of routine. Work, eat, curse, sleep, repeat.
And yet, if you asked one of them whether they regretted it, they might have shrugged and said no. Because while it was misery, it was their misery. The sea stripped life down to its simplest terms: hunger, fatigue, survival. Men who'd spent years being told what to do could finally measure their worth by what they could endure. You could call that freedom, or you could call it stubbornness. Either would fit. Every pirate had their small rituals to keep sane. Some carved marks into the mast for every week survived. Others kept trinkets: a button from a lost coat, a coin from home, a lock of hair from someone they swore to remember. Superstitions filled the spaces where logic failed. A bird landing on the rigging was good luck. Whistling on deck invited a storm. No one challenged these beliefs. On a ship, you didn't mock luck. You needed it too badly.
Sleep was another gamble. Hammocks rocked gently, but the noises never stopped. The creak of wood, the slap of water, snores, whispers, the occasional scream from a nightmare. The air was heavy with heat and rum fumes. Some nights you'd swear the ship itself was breathing, slow, labored, almost human. Those who couldn't sleep counted the sounds. Others talked quietly, telling lies about the lives they'd left behind. Every man's story began with some version of regret: a fight, a debt, a mistake. Few had chosen piracy out of ambition. It was simply the last option left open. Morning brought the same duties again: swabbing, patching, climbing, scrubbing. There were no holidays at sea, only slightly less miserable days. Still, there were moments of beauty. The sunrise after a storm, when the sea went perfectly still. The sight of dolphins pacing the ship, their smooth backs glinting like steel. The brief quiet before dawn, when the wind calmed and the world smelled clean for once. Those moments didn't redeem the life, but they made it bearable. On land, people imagined pirates as roaring adventurers, drunk on power and gold. In truth, most were thin, sunburned, and covered in sores. Their gold, when they found it, was usually melted down into coins they lost at the next port. Their power ended the moment they faced a Navy ship. And adventure? That was just another word for exhaustion. Yet the myth endured because it was easier to romanticize suffering than to accept it. People preferred the idea of freedom, not the smell of it.
Blackbeard's ghost became a story, then a symbol, then a brand. The man who died clutching a sword became a hero to people who'd never lifted one. The real pirates, the ones swabbing decks, boiling water, tying knots in the dark, they disappeared, as working people usually do, into silence. There's a kind of justice in that. The sea remembers no one. It doesn't care how many tales we tell. Every ship ends the same way: rotting wood and scattered bones. But for the brief years they lived, the pirates turned the sea into their own country, a place ruled not by kings or gods, but by exhaustion and laughter. A floating democracy of the desperate. They fought, drank, cursed, sang, mended, and muttered about how everything could be better if only the rum held out a little longer. To an outsider, it was chaos. To them, it was ordinary life. When they finally made port,
They stumbled ashore in tattered clothes, pockets empty, eyes half wild from the motion of the waves. They spent whatever coin they had on drink, women, or gambling. And within a day, they were broke again. Some enlisted on another ship. Some woke up pressed into naval service. And a few, a lucky few, managed to disappear inland, pretending to be fishermen or carpenters until the law stopped asking questions. But most went back to sea, because land, after a while, felt too still, too civilized. They'd grown addicted to the rhythm of hardship. When you've spent years sleeping beside danger, peace can feel unnatural. That's the quiet truth of life on deck. It wasn't courage that kept them there, or greed, or loyalty. It was habit. The sea had become their whole world, and even misery feels safe once it's familiar.
So, when people imagine pirates grinning over their hoards, picture instead a small, creaking ship, its sails patched, its crew half drunk and half starved, staring at a pile of coins that would barely buy them another week. That's the real story, the price beneath the shine. Gold glitters, yes, but it also blinds. And when it fades, all that's left is the salt, the wind, and the faint smell of smoke. Treasure has always sounded cleaner than it really was. Maps marked with X's, gleaming chests, coins spilling in slow motion. The kind of thing that makes people forget what gold actually smells like. In truth, most treasure wasn't dug from sand or found in caves. It was pried from the hands of other human beings. Loot was sweat and blood turned into currency. When pirates said a prize, they didn't mean discovery. They meant someone else's misfortune. A ship captured, its crew tied and stripped, its cargo divided and fought over until knives came out. The sound of coins clinking in the dark was just the echo of someone else's ruin. And yet, for a few brief hours after a successful raid, the world seemed to stop spinning. Men who'd lived on biscuit and grog feasted like kings. They sang until their throats gave out, drank until they forgot which ship was theirs, and promised each other a future none of them would see. The thing about gold is that it burns, slowly, but it burns. Anne Bonny knew this better than most. Born in Ireland, raised in the Carolinas, she grew up on a small plantation where anger was a kind of inheritance. Her father had money, her mother had scandal, and Anne had a temper that frightened servants. When she married a poor sailor, her father disowned her. She followed her husband to Nassau, the pirate capital of the Caribbean, and somewhere between the noise, the rum, and the rotting docks, she decided to stop pretending to be respectable. Anne joined the crew of Calico Jack, a pirate with taste for bright clothes, bad decisions, and exactly the kind of swagger that impressed young rebels. But she wasn't content to stay in the background. She dressed as a man, fought with the rest, and swore louder than most. Soon enough, her name carried more weight than her captain's. When another woman, Mary Read, joined the crew, the two became inseparable, fighting side by side, sleeping in the same quarters, often mistaken for brothers until their secrets slipped. Even then, the men didn't care much. As long as you could swing a cutlass, you were welcome. The stories say Anne and Mary fought harder than anyone,
During one battle, when the rest of the crew hid below deck, Anne reportedly shouted, "If there's a man among ye, he'll come up and fight like one." None did, so she fought anyway. But heroics aside, the loot never stretched far. After every glorious victory came the hangover of reality. Coins were split, counted, and spent. Arguments broke out. Shares disappeared mysteriously. A man could risk his life for months and end up with enough silver to buy a week's worth of peace in port. The pirates called it the economy of foolish hope. You fought for loot, you drank the loot, and then you fought again to replace it. It was the same hunger that drives gamblers. The idea that the next hand, the next raid, the next sunrise would make it all worth it. Anne and Mary, for all their fame, lived within that same loop. They robbed ships full of sugar, rum, and the occasional gold coin. Nothing mythical, just cargo, barrels, crates, bundles of cloth. They called it treasure because it sounded better than someone else's groceries. The glory was in the taking, not the keeping. The loot had to be sold quickly before the law caught up. Fence it in one port, bribe the right official in another, and vanish before the hangman's rope came into view. By the time the money changed hands twice, half of it was gone. But that never stopped them.
For Anne, piracy wasn't about riches. It was about the rebellion itself, the act of refusing to stay small. She'd spent her life under someone else's command, her father, her husband, her captain. The sea, for all its cruelty, was the first thing that didn't talk back. She once told a crewmate she'd rather die on her feet than live on her knees. And true to her word, she nearly did. In 1720, the ship was cornered by the governor's men. Calico Jack's crew, drunk as usual, barely fought. The women, however, refused to surrender. When the smoke cleared, Anne and Mary were the last ones standing, surrounded by bodies and gunpowder fog. At their trial, both were sentenced to hang. Anne, pregnant, pleaded the belly, an old legal trick that delayed execution until after childbirth. Mary did the same. Mary died in prison soon after. Anne somehow disappeared from the record. Some say her father bought her freedom. Others think she slipped away under another name. Either way, she vanished, which for a pirate is a kind of miracle. But the point isn't how they died, it's what they represented. Anne and Mary were proof that piracy wasn't a man's world, it was just a desperate one. When all the respectable doors were locked, the sea offered a window, small, dangerous, and cold, but open. They paid for it with everything. Freedom, yes, but also isolation, constant fear, a life reduced to storms, hunger, and the metallic taste of risk.
That's the price of loot. Not gold, not jewels, but the erosion of the self. You stop remembering what you were before the ship, before the mask, before the roar of cannons became your lullaby. And yet, even knowing all this, thousands followed the same path, because what waited on land was worse. Poverty, servitude, marriage without choice, labor without end. The sea promised danger, but at least it was an honest one.
Loot was the lie that made it bearable. Even the smallest haul could transform a crew for a week. A handful of silver coins, a bolt of silk, a barrel of rum. Suddenly everyone believed they'd won something meaningful. The singing started. The fights paused. For one night, they felt rich. But gold didn't just corrupt men. It exhausted them. The paranoia set in quickly. Who took more? Who hid a coin? Who pocketed a ruby when no one was looking? Trust dissolved faster than rum. There were stories of crews turning on their captains mid-voyage. Others marooned their shipmates on deserted islands for stealing too much or too little. Every pirate swore loyalty, but every pirate also carried a knife. Anne once said she'd rather sail with the devil than trust a man with a full purse. That might sound like bravado, but it was just experience speaking. The longer they stayed at sea, the less human they became. Not monsters, just stripped down. Gold became their clock, their compass, their god. They forgot what peace looked like. They could only measure life in risk and reward.
That's the quiet tragedy of piracy. It began as rebellion and ended as repetition. Every raid blurred into the next. Every face blurred too. And beneath it all was the same thought, unspoken but shared, that the treasure would somehow make the rest of it worthwhile. It never did. By the time most pirates were caught, they owned nothing worth stealing. Their wealth existed only in stories told after their deaths. Their bones washed up nameless on shores they'd never meant to visit. The gold they'd fought for ended up back in the same vaults it came from, polished, reminted, respectable again. Civilization, as it turns out, always wins the cleanup. But for a short time, the pirates broke the rules, and that mattered, even if it didn't last. Anne Bonny didn't become a legend because she was rich. She became one because she refused to disappear quietly, because she swore, fought, and loved in a world that told her she wasn't supposed to do any of those things. Her story, like all pirate stories, ends somewhere between truth and imagination. Maybe she died in Jamaica. Maybe she lived as someone else. Maybe, just maybe, she sat by the sea in her old age, watching ships pass and wondering why freedom always costs so much. That's the part of piracy the songs never mention. That it's not the hangman or the storm that gets you in the end. It's the emptiness. The realization that all the noise and chaos and gold never really filled the hollow space you started with. Loot was just a mirror. It reflected what you were chasing, not what you found. And for most, that reflection wasn't treasure, it was hunger.
So, when people imagine pirates grinning over their hoards, picture instead a small, creaking ship, its sails patched, its crew half drunk and half starved, staring at a pile of coins that would barely buy them another week. That's the real story, the price beneath the shine. Gold glitters, yes, but it also blinds. And when it fades, all that's left is the salt, the wind, and the faint smell of smoke.
By now, most of the rum was gone, and the stories were starting to sound rehearsed. Every man on the ship claimed to have once been cheated by a captain, a merchant, a king. They all said the same thing in different accents. We only steal from thieves. That's how every revolution begins, with someone claiming moral superiority right before they start looting. And so, to keep their newfound freedom from devouring itself, pirates invented something remarkable: the code. Think of it as a floating constitution written by men who couldn't read very well. Each crew drafted its own, scratched out on parchment or bark or the back of a stolen letter. The rules varied, but the spirit was the same: equality among thieves, fairness in division, and punishment for betrayal. It sounds noble, democratic even, and in a way it was. A pirate ship might have been the freest society of its time. Every man had a vote in choosing the captain. Every man had a voice in planning raids. Spoils were divided by shares, not titles. No one could claim divine right over another, except, of course, when they could. Freedom has a way of curdling when hunger and fear set in. Which brings us to Bartholomew Roberts. Born in Wales in the late 17th century, he started as a respectable sailor. He could read, write, and navigate by the stars, rare gifts among seamen. He drank moderately, cursed sparingly, and was known for his sense of order. In short, he was not pirate material. But then, one day, his ship was captured off the coast of Africa. The pirates offered him a choice: join or die. Roberts thought about it, then joined. Within weeks, he was leading them.
His men called him Black Bart. Unlike most pirate captains, Roberts banned drinking on board. He dressed in fine crimson coats, wore diamond crosses on his hat, and began every morning by reading from a stolen prayer book. Imagine that, a man saying grace before a raid. But here's the strange thing. Under Roberts, piracy briefly resembled civilization. He organized his ships into fleets, enforced strict rules, and drafted a detailed code. It included clauses like, "Every man shall have an equal vote in affairs of moment. No gambling with cards or dice. Lights out by 8 o'clock. No women or boys allowed aboard. Whoever steals from another shall be marooned." Punishments were brutal but consistent: lashes, marooning, or death by musket. Roberts ruled like a schoolmaster with a sword. And the crew loved him for it. Because here's the thing: pirates didn't actually want chaos. They'd had enough of that on merchant ships under captains who beat them, starved them, and stole their wages. What they wanted was justice, or at least a version of it that didn't wear a wig. Under Roberts, everyone had a say. If you disagreed, you spoke up. If you voted against the captain and lost, you accepted it. The ship was a democracy until the battle started. Then it became a dictatorship until the smoke cleared.
It worked astonishingly well. Between 1719 and 1722, Roberts captured more than 400 ships. 400! He terrorized the Atlantic like a polite hurricane, attacking convoys from Brazil to the Caribbean and writing reports about it afterward. He even staged naval reviews, sailing past his own fleet to the sound of trumpets, dressed like an admiral at a parade. It was theater, but it kept morale high. Men followed him because he made piracy feel respectable, as if plundering ships was just another form of trade, slightly louder and more efficient. But beneath that order simmered the same old hunger. For all their votes and codes, pirates still fought over gold, rum, and women. Brotherhood worked fine until temptation entered the room. The code promised equality, but it couldn't change human nature. You could divide the loot fairly,
but you couldn't divide envy. Roberts himself grew weary of it. He once told the captured merchant, "In honest service there is thin commons, low wages, and hard labor. In this, plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power." He said it like a man trying to convince himself. Because what he didn't say, what none of them said, was that liberty without safety is just another kind of servitude. The code might have protected them from each other, but it couldn't protect them from the world. Governors issued bounties, navies tightened their patrols, and the ocean shrank quickly under the weight of empire. The illusion of brotherhood began to crack. There were mutinies, secret alliances, quiet betrayals. Some men sold out others for pardon. Others turned their ships against their own fleets. By 1722, the net was closing. Roberts was cornered off the coast of West Africa by HMS Swallow, a British warship disguised as a trader.
True to form, Roberts dressed for the occasion. He put on his red silk coat, his finest hat, and his diamond cross. He stood on deck calmly, issuing orders as if it were another rehearsal. A cannonball struck him through the neck. He died instantly, still standing. His crew, not wanting his body to be displayed, wrapped him in sailcloth and threw him overboard. The sea took him quietly, no prayers this time. And with him, the dream of the pirate republic went under. After his death, hundreds of pirates were captured and hanged. The code, once copied from ship to ship, disappeared. The age of democracy at sea ended with a single gunshot. But for a few years it had worked. Against every expectation, a group of violent, illiterate men had built one of the most egalitarian societies on Earth. They had rules against stealing, compensation for injury, and the right to vote. Imagine, a sailor missing a leg could still claim his share of loot proportionate to his lost limb. In a world where empires treated sailors as disposable, pirates offered health care. That, more than the gold or the glory, might have been their most radical act, believing that fairness could exist without kings. But fairness, as it turns out, doesn't survive long without someone enforcing it. When Roberts died, so did the discipline. His men fought over what little was left, drinking, looting, and running aground one by one. Within a decade, the Caribbean was quiet again. The ports, once teeming with outlaws, now hosted customs officers. The pirate flags rotted away, and their bones joined the coral below.
All that remained were the stories, and those too were edited. The poets and playwrights turned the pirates into symbols, rebels, lovers, philosophers in disguise. The world prefers its criminals cleaned up. The truth was stranger. They weren't revolutionaries. They were men who'd seen too much order and tried to live without it, only to rebuild it again out of instinct. That's the human flaw the code revealed. We crave freedom, but we can't stand the chaos that comes with it. So we invent rules, break them, and pretend the circle makes sense. For pirates, that contradiction became survival. The code wasn't sacred, it was practical, a way to stop the crew from killing each other before the Navy got the chance. Still, for a time, it gave meaning to the meaningless. It made the sea feel like a nation. Each man had a vote, a share, and a dream that his voice mattered, even if it ended in the hangman's noose. And that illusion, that fragile, shining illusion, might have been worth all the risk.
Because what the code really offered wasn't justice or order, it was belonging. In a world that treated sailors as expendable, pirates built a place, however violent, where every man could say, "I am seen." Black Bart's flag, a skeleton holding an hourglass and a dart, was more than decoration. It was prophecy. Time was running out for them all, and they knew it. But while it lasted, they lived as equals, drunk, dirty, doomed, but equals. And that, perhaps, is why their story lingers. Not because they were noble, or brave, or even successful, but because they tried for a brief and bloody moment to invent fairness in the middle of nowhere.
The brotherhood was an illusion, yes, but what a beautiful one to die believing in. When a pirate tired of the horizon, there was only one place to go: Nassau. It wasn't paradise exactly, more of a drunken compromise between civilization and anarchy. But for a few short years in the early 1700s, it became the closest thing pirates ever had to a home. The island sat like a crooked tooth in the Bahamas, perfectly placed between the trade routes of the New World. Merchant ships passed constantly, fat with sugar, tobacco, gold, and human cargo. To a pirate, that meant opportunity. To Nassau, it meant business. By 1715, the town was a ruin, a wreck left behind after years of colonial war. The wooden fort was half collapsed, the harbor shallow, and the governor had long since fled. Into that vacuum poured the outlaws: English, French, Dutch, African, Irish. Sailors, deserters, freed slaves, escaped debtors, and a few dreamers who thought liberty meant doing whatever they pleased. They called it the Republic of Pirates. No one ruled it officially, but everyone ruled it a little. Ships came and went like tides. The beach glittered with stolen goods. You could buy Spanish silver beside a tavern, a French musket behind a hut, or a bottle of rum in exchange for a story that might not be true. The air smelled of smoke, salt, and fermented fruit. Flies were everywhere. Goats wandered through the streets like citizens. And yet, in that chaos, something remarkable took shape. Men who'd once been hunted by every empire gathered openly in daylight, drinking together, voting together, arguing about nothing and everything. They built crude houses from driftwood and sails. They patched roofs with canvas. They called one hill Parliament, though most of their laws were decided by whoever shouted loudest.
Still, for a while, it worked. Ships were repaired, goods were traded, and the pirates lived like kings. Some even brought their families. Children were born in Nassau who'd never seen a mainland, tiny citizens of a country that technically didn't exist. And presiding over this strange democracy of thieves was Charles Vane. Vane was a contradiction, brave, reckless, and completely incapable of compromise. He'd started as a privateer, licensed by the English crown to attack enemy ships. When peace came, and the license expired, he simply kept going. The only difference was the flag. In Nassau, Vane ruled through charisma and violence. His ship, Ranger, was feared across the Atlantic. He dressed plainly, but carried himself like a nobleman gone mad. He'd drink with his crew one night and flog them the next. He saw himself as a soldier of freedom, though no one could quite tell whose freedom he was fighting for. When King George offered a pardon to any pirate willing to surrender, hundreds accepted. They were tired, broke, and ready for peace. Vane refused. He called the king's offer a leash disguised as mercy. In his view, Nassau wasn't just a hiding place. It was the seed of a new world, one without masters, crowns, or chains. He told his men that the sea had made them equals, and Nassau was proof that such a world could exist on land, too. He was wrong, of course. Because freedom, left alone long enough, starts to rot.
As more ships arrived, the town grew crowded. Taverns spilled into the sand. Fights broke out daily. Disease spread faster than news. Pirates brought back plunder, but also boredom. Without constant danger, their lives lost shape. Men who'd thrived under pressure now drank themselves into paralysis. Even the gold stopped meaning much. You could pay a man in silver to dig you a latrine, and he'd spend it an hour later on rum and dice. The cycle never ended. It was around this time that Woodes Rogers appeared, a former privateer turned colonial governor, armed with royal pardon papers and the quiet confidence of a man who believes in order. He sailed into Nassau Harbor in 1718 with 2 warships and a message from the king: amnesty for those who surrender, death for those who don't. The pirates watched from the shore, blinking in the sunlight like animals caught too long in the dark. Some cursed, some laughed, a few began quietly packing. Rogers stepped ashore and declared, "I have come to rid the world of pirates." It was an ambitious statement for a man standing ankle-deep in sand, surrounded by drunk outlaws. But he meant it. He rebuilt the fort, raised the British flag, and offered clemency to anyone willing to live honestly. Hundreds lined up. Men like Benjamin Hornigold, once a pirate captain himself, switched sides and began hunting his former comrades. It was an efficient strategy. Who better to catch pirates than other pirates? But not Vane. When Rogers demanded he surrender, Vane fired a cannon in reply.
He raided nearby settlements, ambushed supply ships, and tried to rally the disillusioned back to his cause. For a moment, it worked. The idea of rebellion is infectious. But Nassau had changed. The men were tired of running. After one disastrous encounter with a French warship, his crew declared him a coward and voted him out. Vane was marooned on a small island with nothing but a bottle of water and a pistol. He survived, barely, and stole another ship months later, but the world had moved on. His reputation faded, his allies vanished, and he was finally captured in Jamaica. When he was hanged in 1721, the crowd was silent. Vane died as he'd lived, unrepentant, angry, and alone. Back in Nassau, Governor Rogers pressed on. He built roads, reopened trade, and turned the pirate haven into a functioning colony. He also went bankrupt doing it. By the mid-1720s, the Republic of Rogues was gone. The taverns were quieter. The flags came down. The few pirates who remained either took to fishing or drifted off toward Africa, where the slave trade still offered profit to those with strong stomachs and weak consciences. Nassau became respectable again, which is to say, dull. But for a brief, shimmering moment, it had been something extraordinary. A town built entirely by outlaws, a community born not of faith or empire, but fatigue, the desire to live on one's own terms, even if those terms were madness.
Historians like to call it a failed experiment. Maybe it was. But failure doesn't erase meaning.
The pirates of Nassau proved that ordinary men, given the chance, will try to build a world, even if they have no idea how to sustain it. They'll draft rules between hangovers, argue about fairness, and burn the town down if it starts to look too civilized. That was the paradox at the heart of piracy. They wanted freedom, but they also wanted community, and the two rarely coexist for long. Vane understood the first half, Rogers the second. Between them lay the brief miracle of Nassau, an island that tried for a few years to imagine life beyond obedience. When you think of it now, don't picture the chaos or the violence. Picture the quiet moments. Dawn over the harbor, the ships rocking gently, smoke from the cook fires curling into the pink light. Men half asleep on the sand, dreaming of the next voyage. For a heartbeat, they were free. And then, as always, the tide came in. By 1725, the sea was quieter. The flags that once fluttered with skulls and bones had disappeared, folded away, or burned. The taverns in Nassau were almost respectable now, the laughter replaced by the dull rhythm of hammers as new docks rose from the ruins. The world had grown smaller for pirates and larger for empires. For 2 generations, the ocean had been a frontier without borders. Ships drifted from Europe to the Americas and back again like wandering cities, carrying spices, sugar, gunpowder, and ideas. And somewhere between those tides, piracy had found its moment, that brief, feral spark of rebellion before civilization tightened its grip again. Here's the thing. No empire can tolerate ambiguity for long. You can't build colonies, collect taxes, or declare dominion when the sea itself refuses to obey. So one by one, the pirate havens fell. Tortuga, Port Royal, Nassau, and the men who defied every king found themselves cornered. But before the curtain fell, one last figure held the stage. His name was Edward Teach, though the world remembers him by a simpler one, Blackbeard. Teach wasn't just a man, he was a performance. He understood the power of fear, how it could paralyze an enemy faster than bullets. Before battle, he'd weave slow-burning fuses into his beard and light them so smoke curled around him like a demon from the deep. Witnesses said his eyes glowed red in the haze, though that may have been terror talking. He was tall, broad, and oddly deliberate. He never shouted when he could speak softly. He treated his crew with a kind of strict fairness. They said he'd share the loot equally, so long as they obeyed him at sea.
And though he cut a monstrous figure, the truth is, Blackbeard killed fewer men than most royal captains. His legend was more psychology than cruelty. He wanted to be feared, not bloody. The threat was the weapon. He sailed the Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slave ship that he captured and refitted with 40 guns. Under his command, she became the terror of the Atlantic. She blockaded Charleston for a week, held an entire city hostage, and then, just as quickly, vanished into the horizon. But power always invites enemies. By 1718, the British Empire was desperate to make an example.
the governors of Virginia and the Carolinas began hiring men to hunt pirates like animals. One of them was Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a naval officer who'd made a name for himself by being relentless. He set out with 2 small ships pretending to be merchants and found Blackbeard anchored off Ocraque Island in North Carolina. It was November 21, 1718. Dawn, fog thick, the sea slick and silver. Blackbeard might have sailed away. He had the wind, the guns, the experience. But he didn't. He turned to fight. Some say he laughed as the first shots rang out. The smoke hung low on the water. The ships closed. Grappling hooks bit the rails. Then silence, broken by the sound of boots on wood, sabers drawn, and a voice calling out, "Step lively, boys!" Blackbeard charged. The battle that followed lasted only minutes, but felt like eternity. Maynard's men hid below deck until the pirates boarded, then burst out in ambush. The decks turned slick with blood. Pistols flashed. Cutlasses clanged. Teach was shot 5 times and stabbed 20 before he finally fell, still swinging his sword. They cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit, a trophy, a warning, a punctuation mark. It swayed there as the ship turned for home, the body tossed into the sea. Sailors claimed that when it hit the water, it swam 3 laps around the vessel before sinking. People love their ghosts. With Blackbeard's death, something larger died too, the myth of the untamable sea. The Crown had proven that even legends could be dragged ashore and executed. Within a few years, the remaining captains were gone. Calico Jack was hanged in Jamaica, his flag, the familiar skull and crossed swords, nailed above his body. Bonny, his companion, disappeared into history. Black Bart Roberts, perhaps the most successful of them all, was killed in battle in 1722. His death marked the final note of the age. After that, piracy shrank into a whisper. The oceans didn't change, but the world around them did. Navies grew stronger. Trade routes were charted and patrolled. Ships that once carried gold and spices now carried bureaucrats and law. The Caribbean became less a wilderness and more a system: ports, tariffs, paperwork. And in that order, something wild and human was lost. Because here's what piracy really was beneath the flags and fire. It was a story about escape. Escape from kings, from wages, from hierarchy, from the dull grind of obedience. Most of these men had once been sailors in the Royal Navy or merchant fleets, whipped, underpaid, treated as expendable. On a pirate ship, they voted on decisions. They divided the plunder. The captain's word mattered, but so did the crew's. It was crude democracy, brutal, fleeting, but real. The same men who could slit a throat at dusk might spend dawn debating how to ration rum fairly. And that's the irony history rarely admits. For a time, the most egalitarian society on Earth floated on stolen ships. But freedom like that can't last forever. The world is built by those who crave permanence, not passion. And pirates, for all their courage, never built. They only resisted. When the smoke cleared, the sea was the same as it had always been, restless, endless, indifferent. But the men who'd once danced on its surface were gone, reduced to stories told by candlelight. You might still find traces of them if you know where to look. A rusted cannon beneath the reefs of New Providence, a buried coin with the edge worn smooth by time,
a sailor's song half remembered in the bars of Havana. And of course, the stories, always the stories. Every century retells them, softens them, turns them into something romantic. The blood becomes wine, the fear becomes adventure, the greed becomes freedom. We keep resurrecting the pirates because they represent the part of us that wants to vanish, to sail beyond the horizon and never answer to anyone again. But if you listen closely, there's a quieter truth beneath all that noise. Most pirates didn't want riches. Not really. They wanted rest. They wanted the sea, not as a stage, but as an escape from a world that never gave them peace. And maybe that's why their ghosts linger, not out of vengeance, but longing.
If you could stand tonight on the shores of Ocracoke Island and look out toward the dark line of the Atlantic, you might imagine a faint light bobbing far offshore. Maybe it's just a fisherman. Maybe it's something older. A ship crewed by the memory of men who once believed the sea could set them free. Their laughter would be faint now, their songs slow and slurred with time. But if the wind is right, you might hear a voice drift across the waves, saying something like, "The world belongs to those who dare." And then it's gone. The tide moves in, the foam hisses over the sand, the night goes still again, and what was once chaos is quiet now. A story, a whisper, a dream. That's the end of the Golden Age of Piracy, not with a roar, but with a sigh. The sea remains, patient and ancient, waiting for the next fool who believes he can master it. But for now, it sleeps, and perhaps so should we.